On the Eastern Front, surrender did not mean life. For thousands of German soldiers, being captured in combat was as lethal as remaining on the battlefield. The accumulated hatred, the orders of extermination, and the memory of razed villages made immediate execution a common practice. The prisoners were lined up in ditches, hanged on trees, or shot down on rural roads without record or trial. Some were shot in front of the population as a warning, others fell in forced marches where death came from hunger, cold, or summary executions. The bloodiest front of the war left no room for international norms. Why did capture amount to an immediate sentence? What role did extermination orders play in legitimizing those deaths? How is a front remembered today, where defeat almost always ended in execution? The War Without Rules, Barbarossa, and the Extermination Order. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, began. From its conception, it was designed as a type of war different from any other fought in Europe until that moment. It was not only a clash between armies, but an ideological and racial conflict meticulously planned by the Nazi regime. Adolf Hitler had expressed in the 1920s in his programmatic work that the Eastern Territory should become Germany's living space. In that vision, Slavic populations were classified as inferior beings whose function was limited to servitude or physical elimination. The planning of the invasion was carried out in coordination between the Wehrmacht and the political authorities of the Third Reich. Unlike previous campaigns, the aim was not only to defeat the enemy's army to achieve a negotiated peace. The declared purpose was to destroy the Soviet system and radically transform its territories. This conception placed the civilian population, economic resources, and political structures of the adversary as legitimate military targets. Directives issued weeks before the attack confirmed this approach and marked a different course in the conduct of the war. On the 6th of June of 1941, the German High Command issued the Kommissar Order, known in German as Kommissarbefehl. This document established that the political commissars of the Red Army, captured in combat, were to be executed immediately upon their detention. The commissars were Communist Party cadres integrated into the Soviet military units, and their mission was to ensure the ideological fidelity of the soldiers. For the Nazi authorities, these figures symbolized the Bolshevik enemy in its purest form and, consequently, were not recognized as prisoners of war under international conventions. The order provided that they were not to be transferred to prisoner camps but summarily eliminated at the place of their capture. The application of this measure varied according to the leaders and the units, but its effects were immediate. Numerous commissars were shot after surrendering, sometimes in front of other prisoners, as a method of intimidation. Some German officers expressed private reservations about the legality and potential repercussions, although in practice the order was widely followed. This deliberately broke with international law and institutionalized extrajudicial execution as part of the war policy. In parallel, between April and May of that same year, the so-called Barbarossa orders were issued. These instructions exempted German soldiers from criminal responsibility in case of committing crimes against Soviet civilians. In practice, they authorized summary executions of anyone suspected of resistance and legitimized collective punishments to entire communities. With this, collective responsibility was institutionalized as an operational norm, expanding the scope of violence beyond regular combat. Another essential component was the policy of starvation, known as the Hunger Plan, designed under the direction of Herbert Bach in the Ministry of Food of the Reich. The plan stipulated that the agricultural resources of Ukraine and southern Russia should be primarily allocated to supply Germany and its troops. Planners estimated that this redistribution of resources would lead to the death by starvation of millions of Soviets, especially in urban areas considered dispensable. Hunger was thus conceived as a strategic weapon and as a means of demographic restructuring. During the first few weeks of the invasion, these policies were translated into the systematic destruction of villages, the execution of hostages, and mass deportations. After the advance of the Wehrmacht, the Einsatzgruppen acted. Special SS units tasked with eliminating Jews, commissars, intellectuals, and other groups considered hostile to the Reich. Although formally separate from the regular army, these units received logistical support from the German forces operating under the same framework of impunity. The result was the establishment of a regime of planned violence in the occupied territories. The impact on the civilian population was immediate. Rural communities were razed under suspicion of collaboration with the resistance. The crops and livestock were confiscated, which generated famines in extensive regions. In Belarus and Ukraine, mass deportations of inhabitants destined for forced labor in the Reich were carried out. Thousands of people were executed as reprisal for isolated partisan attacks. These measures, aimed at controlling the population, were perceived as acts of indiscriminate terror. The Red Army, in full retreat during that year, received constant information about the massacres. The soldiers who survived the first months of the offensive were direct witnesses to the destruction of their villages and the death of their relatives. Soviet propaganda did not need to elaborate fictional stories, as the devastation was visible and verifiable. This knowledge generated an increase in hatred towards the invader and hardened the attitude towards German prisoners. Internal NKVD documents reflect that as early as 1941, there were records of immediate executions of German captives as a result of growing pressure among the troops. Although the official directives called for the transfer of prisoners to the rear in practice, violence was imposed as a direct response to the German policies of extermination. The ideological character of the campaign decisively influenced this dynamic of reciprocal violence. Hitler had presented the operation as an existential struggle against Jewish Bolshevism, instructing his troops not to consider the Soviets as honorable adversaries, but as enemies to be eradicated. This discourse encouraged German soldiers to ignore international norms of war. In turn, the inhumane treatment given to millions of captured Soviet prisoners, dead from hunger, cold, or executions, reinforced among the combatants of the Red Army the conviction that the Germans did not deserve a different fate when falling into their hands. The scorched earth tactic constituted another dimension of the catastrophe. During their advance, the Germans destroyed crops and houses to prevent the enemy from using them. At the same time, Stalin ordered the Soviet troops to apply the same principle in their retreat, setting villages on fire and moving factories inland. The local population was caught between two forces applying systematic devastation measures. Millions of displaced resulted from this dual policy, in a scenario where material destruction added to the planned violence. The balance of the first year of the invasion was devastating. Millions of Soviet prisoners died in captivity, most from hunger, exposure, and summary executions. The civilian population in the occupied areas suffered massive losses from collective shootings, induced famines, and deportations. The magnitude of the catastrophe was recorded in official reports and in the direct testimony of survivors who reached the Soviet lines. For the Red Army fighters, this reality eliminated the possibility of considering surrender as an option for survival. The conviction that becoming a prisoner meant death transformed their combat morale and conditioned the treatment they would dispense to captured German soldiers in the future. The Nazi orders, conceived as instruments to break Soviet resistance through terror, generated the opposite effect. Instead of facilitating a quick victory, they consolidated the determination of the population and the Red Army. The executions of commissars, the massacres of villages, and the hunger policy were etched into the immediate memory of the fighters and civilians under occupation. That memory became one of the factors that would fuel the chain of reprisals and executions of captured German soldiers, a phenomenon that would acquire a growing dimension in the subsequent years. Immediate executions, revenge on the battlefield. The German invasion of the Soviet Union created from its beginnings a framework of violence in which surrender did not guarantee survival. In the first months of Operation Barbarossa, documented records of immediate executions of German soldiers captured by Red Army troops and by partisan groups in the occupied territories appeared. These actions did not arise from a centralized policy, but from local reactions conditioned by the observed devastation, accumulated hatred, and the widespread perception that the Germans did not respect the international norms on the treatment of prisoners. In Ukraine, where the German offensive rapidly advanced toward Kiev and the Dnieper, there were some of the first confirmed cases of German soldiers executed after their capture. Reports from the NKVD from the end of 1941 mentioned shootings of prisoners in the vicinity of Kharkov. The justification noted in these documents was the impossibility of safely transporting the captives to the rear in a context of disrupted communications and disorganized supply lines. The collective shootings usually involved small groups of men lined up against destroyed walls or anti-tank ditches and eliminated by improvised platoons of Soviet soldiers. No detailed interrogations or formal identification processes were conducted. In Belarus, the dynamics took on a distinct profile due to the early formation of local partisan groups. In a region that fell under German control from the start of the invasion, peasants, straggling soldiers, and communist cadres organized an irregular resistance. Among their most frequent practices was the immediate execution of isolated or ambushed German soldiers on secondary routes. German documents from 1942 report missing patrols whose bodies were later found in shallow graves or hanging in forests. These displays aimed to send a message to both the occupants and the local population. Any captured German soldier would be eliminated without delay. In the battles of Smolensk, during the summer of 1941, shootings were reported after the capture of German stragglers during the retreat. The prisoners were briefly interrogated and, in the absence of information considered useful, executed in abandoned anti-tank ditches. A similar pattern was repeated in the defense of Moscow in the winter of that same year. Reports from the Stavka indicate that political commissars were authorized to order summary executions in villages near the capital. The extreme cold, lack of infrastructure, and collapse of communications were arguments used to justify the immediate elimination of the captured, considered an unmanageable risk in those circumstances. In Kursk, during the summer of 1943, the tank battle caused thousands of casualties in a few days. Among the prisoners taken in the Prokhorovka clashes, immediate executions occurred. Subsequent German reports collect testimonies from survivors who managed to escape the encirclement and describe arbitrary divisions. Some soldiers were sent to the rear, while others were shot at the edges of the battlefields. The methods of execution varied according to the situation. Executions by firing squad with small arms were the most common, but not the only ones. In urban confrontations, there were cases where German soldiers captured in buildings were eliminated with grenades thrown inside, thus avoiding keeping them in custody in the midst of combat. In other sectors, the physical proximity of the fight led to stabbings with bayonets after surrender. These actions responded both to the intensity of the combat and to the material impossibility of keeping the prisoners under control. In rural areas, improvised hangings became a characteristic method. In Belarus and Ukraine, there were documented cases of German soldiers hanged in squares or visible trees, sometimes accompanied by handwritten signs presenting them as retaliation for the destruction of homes or for the murders of civilians. The bodies were kept exposed for days with the aim of intimidating the population and conveying warnings to the enemy. The Soviet summary justice was characterized by speed and by the absence of standardized procedures. Prisoners were usually interrogated for a few minutes. If they did not offer valuable information or if they were identified as members of units involved in atrocities, the execution was immediate. Political commissars had the authority to decide on the life of the captives, and on numerous occasions they ordered the elimination of all the prisoners of a specific military action. The official arguments alluded to logistical limitations and the lack of security in transfers, although in practice they constituted a tolerated policy of systematic elimination. The local partisans operated with fewer restrictions than the regular units. In Belarus, captured German patrols were publicly executed in front of the population as a message directed at potential collaborators and the occupiers themselves. In western Ukraine, there were documented cases in which prisoners were incinerated in buildings presented as reprisals for previous fires set by German troops. These actions did not pursue military information nor resolve logistical problems, but rather functioned as symbolic acts of reprisal, reflecting a higher degree of violence. The reports of the NKVD from 1942 confirm that summary executions were known and tolerated practices. Although official instructions stipulated the transfer of prisoners to rear camps, the war of constant movements and interrupted communications made it impossible to apply them regularly. Administrative documents describe these executions as preventative measures to eliminate dangerous elements or prevent escapes, using terminology that concealed what in practice was the deliberate elimination of prisoners. The behavior of the Soviet troops was directly conditioned by the treatment received by millions of Soviet prisoners under German custody. By 1942, it was widely known that soldiers captured by the Wehrmacht hardly survived. Information about planned starvation, executions, and massive mortality circulated widely among the units. Under these conditions, many Soviet fighters considered it useless to preserve the lives of enemy soldiers. Immediate elimination became an unwritten operational principle on various fronts. As the war intensified, cases of immediate executions multiplied. During the counter-offensive after Moscow and in battles like Kursk, Soviet troops encountered thousands of weakened or straggling German soldiers. The practice of shooting those who could not be moved became a repeated pattern. The combination of reprisals for observed atrocities, logistical constraints, and the perception of operational uselessness in holding prisoners consolidated a dynamic of violence that spread across the entire Eastern Front. For the Soviet soldiers, these executions were interpreted as acts of direct justice against the crimes committed by the invader. The destruction of villages, the massacres of civilians, and the policy of starvation had created a context in which the elimination of German prisoners was seen as a proportional and legitimate response. The result was the establishment of an immediate cycle of violence that became part of the war experience on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad, the condemnation of the prisoners. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between the summer of 1942 and February of 1943, represented one of the decisive moments of the war on the Eastern Front. The German defeat meant the loss of one of their most experienced forces and the massive capture of tens of thousands of soldiers subjected to extreme conditions of captivity. The capitulation of the Sixth Army between the 31st of January and the 2nd of February of 1943 left nearly 90,000 prisoners in Soviet hands. Among them were 24 generals and more than 2,000 officers. The collapse meant the practical disappearance of a complete army with its command structure, its logistical reserves, and its operational capacity. The surrender did not occur uniformly. Some isolated groups fought for a few more days, others surrendered in small contingents as they exhausted their ammunition, and the majority laid down their arms when there were no more supplies or means of resistance left. The physical conditions of the surrendered were disastrous. After months of siege, prolonged hunger, and extreme temperatures, the soldiers showed severe exhaustion with tattered uniforms and no useful ammunition. Diseases such as dysentery, typhus, and frostbite were widespread. The Sixth Army had collapsed logistically before its surrender, so the prisoners handed over were already on the brink of vital collapse. The transfer to the rear camps became a lethal experience. The Soviet units in charge of custody lacked the means to provide food, motorized transport, or adequate shelter. Columns of thousands of men were forced to march for days and weeks in temperatures of 20 and 30 degrees below zero. Without food, many resorted to tree bark, potato scraps, or meat from dead horses. Those who did not keep up the pace were beaten or executed on the spot. Along the evacuation routes, the frozen corpses of those who fell remained in sight, accumulating on the edges of the roads. In the early stages of these marches, mortality was massive. Soviet documents acknowledge that tens of thousands died from hypothermia, acute hunger, and summary executions. The NKVD admitted in internal reports that the percentage of casualties was extraordinarily high, although they presented it as an inevitable consequence of the extreme weakness of the prisoners after months of siege. The makeshift detention centers were also unprepared for such a large influx. In Beketovka, on the outskirts of Stalingrad, tens of thousands of men were concentrated in unheated barracks without individual beds. The daily ration consisted of a thin soup and low-quality bread, incapable of meeting minimum subsistence needs. Access to drinking water was limited and sanitary conditions were non-existent. Diseases like typhus and dysentery spread rapidly. Other groups were sent to facilities in Tambov and Saratov, where the conditions did not differ substantially. Subsequent reports from international observers described the prisoners in a state of starvation, with emaciated bodies and symptoms of diseases in advanced stages. The Soviet doctors were few and lacked basic medicines. The severely wounded died in the first days without receiving treatment. The figures reflect the magnitude of the tragedy. Of the approximately 90,000 captured by the end of 1943, only about 20,000 survived. Over the years, between transfers to camps in Siberia, the Caucasus or Central Asia, and the mortality associated with forced labor, barely about 5,000 were repatriated to Germany. These repatriations occurred in the 1950s after negotiations between Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and the Soviet authorities. The treatment received was characterized by the indifference of many Soviet soldiers towards the suffering of the prisoners. The total destruction of the city, with hundreds of thousands of civilians dead during the fighting, created an environment in which the German captive was looked upon with disdain. The guards physically pushed the columns and did not intervene when someone fell exhausted. On numerous occasions, they shot at those who attempted to stop, reinforcing the perception among the prisoners that surrender equaled a death sentence. From the Soviet perspective, some soldiers who participated in the Guard later acknowledged that the prisoners were practically living corpses and that it was impossible to keep them alive with the resources available. Although some showed compassion, the memory of the devastation caused by the Wehrmacht in Stalingrad and in other cities ruled out any possibility of clemency. In parallel, the NKVD organized interrogations of captured officers and generals. Among them was Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, who later collaborated in propaganda activities against the Nazi regime. However, most of the intermediate officers did not receive differentiated treatment. After brief interrogations, they were sent to camps where they died in conditions similar to their troops. The contrast between the fate of the high-ranking commanders and that of the common soldiers was significant. While some generals were preserved for their propaganda value, the large mass of prisoners received no special consideration. The differentiation reinforced the perception that Soviet captivity was equivalent in practice to a death sentence, with few exceptions motivated by political interests. The episode of Stalingrad was unique in its scale and consequences. The simultaneous capture of tens of thousands of men in conditions of physical collapse, combined with the logistical inability to sustain them, led to unprecedented mortality. On other fronts, prisoners could be gradually redistributed to camps where, despite extreme conditions, survival was statistically higher. In Stalingrad, the combination of hunger, cold, disease, and lack of resources turned surrender into an almost absolute sentence. Operation Bagration, the extermination of Army Group Center. In June of 1944, while Allied forces were consolidating their positions after the landing in Normandy, the Red Army launched one of the most devastating offensives of the entire war in Belarusian territory. The strategic operation, named Bagration, aimed at the annihilation of the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center, deployed on a front that extended from Polotsk to Bobruisk. The result was the total destruction of dozens of German divisions and the massive capture of soldiers whose fate was marked by summary executions, forced marches with extreme mortality, and local massacres spread throughout Belarusian territory. The offensive began on the 22nd of June, exactly 3 years after the start of Barbarossa. The Stavka concentrated in Belarus more than 2 million combatants supported by thousands of tanks and planes. Opposing them, Army Group Center had a force that did not reach 1 million men, largely composed of inexperienced recruits and units weakened by years of combat. The imbalance was absolute from the start. In a few days, multiple defensive lines collapsed. Key cities such as Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev were surrounded by Soviet armored forces advancing at a speed greater than the German reaction capacity. The capture of prisoners reached unprecedented proportions since Stalingrad. In Vitebsk, 5 divisions were surrounded and more than 30,000 men surrendered in a matter of days. In Bobruisk, after urban fighting that lasted close to 1 week, 40,000 soldiers laid down their arms when their ammunition was completely exhausted. In Minsk, the capital of the Soviet Republic of Belarus, the fall of the encirclement meant the capture of about 100,000 men, a decisive blow for Army Group Center. The forced marches to the rear were characterized by lethal conditions. Columns of thousands of prisoners traveled hundreds of kilometers on rural roads without sufficient food or water. Soldiers who could not keep the pace were separated and executed with shots to the head, their bodies left abandoned by the roadside. Hunger became a deliberate instrument of control. The rations were minimal and sometimes non-existent for several consecutive days. At night pauses, the prisoners tried to collect leaves, grass, or bark to stave off hunger. A Soviet internal report from July of 1944 acknowledged very high mortality rates during transfers, attributing them to the extreme weakness of the captives and logistical limitations. However, German testimonies collected in the post-war period emphasize that the guards applied an extremely severe discipline, immediate punishments against those who stopped, and the systematic abandonment of stragglers condemned to die from cold, hunger, or exhaustion. In addition to the marches, collective executions occurred in localities where partisan resistance had been intense. In Glusk, dozens of prisoners were lined up against walls damaged by the fighting and shot after the Soviet occupation. In the Naliboki forest, local partisans captured a patrol of more than 40 men and executed them without interrogations, burying the bodies in an improvised mass grave. These episodes, although smaller in scale than the marches, show the fragmented and dispersed nature of the violence that accompanied the operation. The difference with Stalingrad was evident in the handling of the captives. In Stalingrad, the prisoners were centralized in a few improvised camps, where the majority died in the months following due to hunger and diseases. In Bagration, the magnitude and geographical dispersion of the captures prevented a centralized system. The Stavka had designed the operation with a priority military objective: to destroy Army Group Center and liberate Belarus. The subsequent management of tens of thousands of prisoners had not been foreseen. The consequence was improvisation, endless marches with high mortality rates, executions during transfers, and local massacres organized by partisans or security units. The NKVD set up temporary camps in Gomel, Smolensk, and Minsk, but the saturation was immediate. A considerable part of the prisoners never reached these facilities and died on the roads or in summary executions. The available figures indicate that out of more than 300,000 captured during Bagration, only a fraction reached the formal records of prisoner camps. The majority disappeared on the marches or in local massacres. Those who survived the transfers were employed in forced labor. In Minsk, they participated in the reconstruction of the devastated city, as well as in the repair of railway infrastructure and roads destroyed by the fighting. Even so, the initial physical weakness and extreme working conditions drastically reduced the chances of survival. The repatriation figures show that very few of those captured during Bagration managed to return to Germany in the years following. This reality makes the operation one of the greatest human disasters suffered by the Wehrmacht throughout the entire conflict. The symbolic dimension also had relevance. In July of 1944, close to 57,000 German prisoners were forced to march through the streets of Moscow in what was called the March of the Defeated. This exceptional episode, designed for propaganda purposes, showed the world the magnitude of the German defeat. However, what was not publicly displayed were the thousands of dead along the rural roads of Belarus, whose deaths were recorded only in administrative archives. The death marches from the battlefield to captivity. The massive surrenders on the Eastern Front did not mean an orderly transfer for German soldiers to Soviet rear facilities. For tens of thousands of prisoners, capture turned into the beginning of a new form of suffering. Forced marches that stretched for hundreds of kilometers without food provisions, adequate shelter, or nightly refuge. These marches, improvised by units of the Red Army or NKVD agents, became true death sentences for men who, after surviving the combat, lacked the physical strength to overcome additional endurance tests. The first documented records of this phenomenon date back to the winter of 1941, when the German offensive was halted in the vicinity of Moscow. Small groups of soldiers captured during the fighting were forced to walk to detention centers in the rear. Temperatures regularly dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Without adequate clothing for such extreme conditions, many prisoners fell exhausted in the snow and were abandoned by the guards. The corpses remained frozen in the same positions in which they had fallen, turning the roads into corridors of death visible to those marching behind. As the war intensified, forced marches became standard procedure. In Ukraine, after the battles of 1943 and 1944, columns of prisoners were led to cities like Kharkov or Kiev. These journeys lasted several days and often exceeded 100 kilometers. The captives rarely received rations. Occasionally, some local civilians threw fragments of bread, but in many places the population, marked by the memory of the German occupation, responded with insults, stones, and spits. The psychological humiliation was added to the hunger and exhaustion, creating conditions in which survival depended almost exclusively on individual physical resistance. In Latvia, after the fighting of the summer of 1944, the prisoners were forced to travel long distances to Riga and Daugavpils. The heat and dehydration caused numerous collapses on the roads. The rule imposed by the guards was clear: any man who could not get up immediately was executed on the spot. The shootings of stragglers were so frequent that the ditches next to the roads were filled with abandoned bodies. The official Soviet reports described these deaths as inevitable, attributing them to the poor physical condition of the captives. However, the testimonies collected after the war insist that they were deliberate executions used as a disciplinary method. In Poland, after the Vistula offensive in January of 1945, thousands of captured German soldiers were forced to march in the middle of winter to improvised camps in cities like Lublin. The extreme cold and the absolute lack of food caused extraordinary mortality. Testimonies mention that the prisoners slept directly on the snow, without blankets or shelters. At dawn, dozens of bodies remained motionless, victims of hypothermia and hunger. The corpses were scattered along the roads, later collected by specialized teams or simply abandoned. The NKVD played a central role in organizing these marches. Its agents selected prisoners directly on the battlefield. Those identified as SS members or from special units were separated and executed immediately. The rest were subjected to physical punishments during the marches. Blows with rifle butts or wooden sticks were common to impose the pace. Internal reports of the organization acknowledged that the commanders had explicit authorization to eliminate those who could not continue, which in practice amounted to summary executions. The dispossession of belongings was another common practice. Watches, rings, documents, and family photographs were confiscated at the beginning of the marches or during the nightly pauses. Hunger was also used as a tool of psychological control. The scarce rations were distributed arbitrarily, favoring those who showed absolute obedience and punishing with prolonged fasting those who resisted or protested. The casualty figures are difficult to specify due to the destruction of records and the dispersion of events, but conservative estimates speak of tens of thousands of dead. During the German retreat from Ukraine in 1943, it is estimated that between 10,000 and 15,000 prisoners died on the journeys to detention facilities. After Operation Bagration in Belarus in 1944, the losses were even greater. Of the more than 300,000 soldiers captured, only a portion were formally registered in prisoner camps. The majority perished along the way. In Poland, in the winter of 1945, additional thousands died on marches that lasted weeks. This phenomenon was not limited to large operations. Even in local confrontations, small groups of prisoners were forced to cover distances that, although not exceeding 50 kilometers, proved deadly for those who were weakened. The severe weather and lack of logistics turned any transfer into a lethal process. The survivors' accounts describe scenes of desperation. Prisoners crawling on the ground to keep moving, companions sharing the last crumbs of bread, bodies carried on shoulders by others to avoid immediate executions. Some even asked the guards to kill them to end the suffering. They rarely received compassion. The most common response was immediate shooting. The final destination of those who survived the marches did not imply a significant improvement. Upon reaching the makeshift camps, they faced chronic hunger, the spread of diseases, and forced labor in extreme conditions. The marches thus served as an initial survival filter. Only those who physically endured the journey could reach the detention facilities. For a large part of those captured, the true ordeal was not the subsequent captivity, but the path they had to travel to reach it. The Empire of Hunger, the Gulag as an extermination machine. The network of Soviet forced labor camps, known as Gulag, became the final destination for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners captured on the Eastern Front. From the early months of the German invasion, and with greater intensity starting from 1943, the system progressively absorbed tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers and their allies. What for Soviet planners was a consolidated structure to control dissidents and exploit internal resources, transformed into a mechanism for managing foreign prisoners that in practice meant forced labor, prolonged hunger, and extraordinarily high mortality. The Gulag operated since the 1930s as an integral part of the regime. It encompassed thousands of camps distributed from the Arctic regions to Central Asia, originally intended for political prisoners, common criminals, and ethnic minorities considered hostile. With the massive arrival of prisoners of war, many of those camps were adapted and expanded. The NKVD organized specific facilities for foreign captives in Karaganda, Vorkuta, Sverdlovsk, Norilsk, and Tashkent. In most cases, these were pre-existing camps, now saturated with contingents far exceeding those planned. Forced labor constituted the operational core of these facilities. The German prisoners were employed in mining, logging, road and railroad construction, repairing destroyed infrastructure, and in certain complexes in the extraction of uranium and coal under extremely dangerous conditions. In Vorkuta and Norilsk, coal mining was conducted in sub-zero temperatures for a large part of the year. In Karaganda, on the steppes of Kazakhstan, the prisoners worked in mineral extraction and agricultural activities in an environment of structural scarcity of food and water. In the Caucasus, they were assigned to repair destroyed bridges and roads, often without adequate tools and always under armed supervision. The working days were extended between 10 and 12 hours daily. The minimal breaks were intended solely for consuming an insufficient portion of watery soup and low-quality black bread. Individual productivity became a criterion for survival. Those who managed to maintain a superior performance level could receive marginally better rations. Those who fell into physical weakness entered a cycle of irreversible starvation. Diseases spread rapidly in the overcrowded barracks. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis were responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. Sanitary facilities were rudimentary or non-existent, and medical services were insufficient. Epidemic outbreaks swept unchecked through saturated wards. Hunger further weakened physical defenses and turned any infection into an almost certain sentence. The barracks consisted of poorly insulated wooden structures without adequate heating. The bunks were simple platforms shared by dozens of prisoners without mattresses or blankets. During the winters, the temperatures dropped to extreme levels and the clothing provided was insufficient. In summer, the accumulation of insects and parasites worsened the spread of gastrointestinal diseases. Hunger was the central element in the process of degradation. Daily rations rarely exceeded the minimum necessary to maintain vital functions after long days of work. Prisoners developed edema, accelerated loss of muscle mass, and generalized weakness. Many resorted to consuming grass, bark, or waste found in garbage dumps. Permanent hunger progressively turned them into shadows incapable of holding tools or performing significant physical exertion. The testimonies of German survivors describe scenes of systematic dispossession. Upon arrival, they were deprived of watches, rings, documents, and family photographs, and distributed into labor brigades without an adaptation period. The constant search for food became the dominant activity outside of working hours. Exchanging personal items for pieces of bread, begging guards for leftovers, or searching through garbage bins were common practices. The dehumanization was deliberate. The guards treated the prisoners as disposable labor without value beyond their immediate productive capacity. The sick who could not work were separated in barracks where mortality was daily. The burial of corpses was the task of the surviving prisoners themselves. In winter, the bodies accumulated in open areas until the ground allowed trenches to be dug. Throughout the year, the turnover of workers was very high, with a life expectancy of just a few months for the majority. The mortality figures document the magnitude. It is estimated that 1 million German soldiers died in Soviet captivity, the majority within the Gulag system. Official Soviet statistics acknowledge about 400,000 deaths, but later studies in Germany and Russia double that figure, including the missing and those never recorded. Mortality peaked between 1943 and 1946, when camp saturation coincided with food shortages throughout the Soviet Union. The massive arrival of prisoners after operations like Bagration in 1944 overwhelmed the system. In Karaganda, the prisoner population exceeded 40,000 in a few months, generating an immediate health collapse. In Vorkuta, where temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero, the mortality rate was so high that the bodies were moved directly from the barracks to common ditches. In Norilsk, industrial construction work was carried out almost exclusively with German labor in a state of extreme weakness, and few survived the first winter. The physical degradation was accompanied by a profound psychological deterioration. Many prisoners fell into a state of total apathy, known in the camp jargon as muscle man, in which the will to live completely disappeared. In such conditions, death came within a matter of days. The Gulag system functioned, in practical terms, as a form of prolonged execution. Unlike the immediate shootings on the battlefield or the lethal marches where death occurred in hours or days, here the agony extended over weeks or months. Hunger, untreated diseases, and exhausting labor progressively reduced the chances of survival to minimal levels. Only a minority managed to physically endure until the late repatriations, which in some cases occurred more than 1 decade after the official end of the war. Twilight of the Reich, captivity without return. The German capitulation in May of 1945 did not mean the immediate end of suffering for millions of soldiers and civilians linked to the Nazi regime. On the Eastern Front, the formal surrender marked the beginning of a period characterized by reprisals, mass deportations, and forced labor that would last for years. The collapse of the Reich coincided with a moment of maximum violence, especially in territories of Eastern Europe devastated by years of German occupation. In East Germany and Poland, immediate executions took place during the weeks following the cessation of hostilities. Soviet troops and local militias executed surrendered German soldiers, Wehrmacht officers, and members of police forces who had participated in operations against civilians. In Polish villages where German massacres had been particularly intense, the inhabitants organized public lynchings. Some prisoners were shot in central squares or hanged from trees as direct retaliation for atrocities committed in the same locality. The NKVD files document thousands of summary executions carried out in the spring and summer of 1945, with notable concentrations in Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia. These executions were carried out both on the initiative of military commanders and by spontaneous actions of local civilians. Once territorial control was consolidated, Soviet policy shifted towards mass deportations of the German population. Already in December of 1944, Moscow had issued an order establishing the deportation of all men between 17 and 45 years, and women considered fit for physical labor in the recovered areas of Eastern Europe. Between 1945 and 1946, around 200,000 people were transferred from Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to the interior of the Soviet Union. They were joined by Wehrmacht prisoners captured in Germany, sent in cattle trains or forced marches to labor camps. The selection criterion was broad. It included not only active combatants, but also civilians considered useful for reconstruction, women who had served in auxiliary organizations, communications operators, medical personnel, and nurses. In many cases, simple identification as a collaborator of the regime was enough to be deported. These measures were officially justified as part of war reparations. Stalin had declared to the Allies that German labor must compensate for the devastation suffered by the Soviet Union. The prisoners and deportees were employed in strategic projects. In the Donbass and the Urals, they worked in coal mines. In Jakimov, in Czechoslovakia under Soviet control, they were employed in the extraction of uranium intended for the nuclear program. In Siberia and Kazakhstan, they were forced to build railway lines, fell forests, and perform agricultural work in regions of low productivity. In destroyed cities like Stalingrad, Minsk, and Smolensk, they participated in the reconstruction of buildings and infrastructure. The working conditions were similar to those of the Gulag system: workdays of more than 10 hours, insufficient food, and constant surveillance. The mortality rate was high, especially in the early post-war years, when the Soviet Union faced food shortages even for its own population. Between 1945 and 1949, tens of thousands of German prisoners died from hunger, exhaustion, and untreated illnesses in the context of these deportations and forced labor. The releases began partially in 1946. The main criterion was health status. Seriously ill, invalids, and elderly were repatriated before the young people in working condition. Between 1946 and 1947, thousands of soldiers returned to Germany in a state of extreme weakness and with permanent sequelae. However, the majority of the young captives remained in camps for several more years. In 1948 and 1949, with the consolidation of the German Democratic Republic and the reorganization of Eastern Europe, the pace of releases increased. Even so, high-ranking officers and members of the SS remained in captivity until the early 1950s. The broader repatriation occurred in 1955 after Konrad Adenauer's negotiations with Moscow, allowing the return of thousands of prisoners who had spent a decade in Soviet camps. The survivors arrived with irreversible physical after-effects, chronic tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, respiratory problems stemming from exposure to toxic substances, and injuries from forced labor without protective measures. The psychological impact was equally profound. Many remembered the constant hunger, the initial marches, and the daily sight of death among their fellow captives. These experiences left lasting alterations in those who managed to survive. A portion of the repatriates chose to remain silent in post-war Germany. Society sought to rebuild itself, and in many cases it was difficult to convey experiences marked by military defeat and German responsibility for war crimes. In the German Democratic Republic, under Soviet influence, the existence of German prisoners in the USSR was minimized and presented as a process of anti-fascist re-education. In the Federal Republic of Germany, on the other hand, the issue became a central political matter. Associations of relatives demanded the return of the missing and organized public events to keep the memory of the captives alive. The final calculation of casualties places the number of Germans dead in Soviet captivity at around 1 million. The figure includes those who died in the Gulag system and those who perished during deportations and post-war marches. The magnitude of these losses makes captivity in the Soviet Union one of the most devastating episodes of the German experience on the Eastern Front. For many soldiers, the surrender of May of 1945 did not signify the end of the war, but the beginning of a prolonged captivity. The late repatriation, in some cases 10 years later, shows that the war experience for thousands of men did not conclude until the mid-1950s. The violence of the Eastern Front thus extended beyond the time frame of the war, prolonging its effects on the lives of the defeated long after the signing of the capitulation.